welcome everyone. And the reason we're here is because we have been in existence for 40 years. And the show, is all about that, and it's called The Diversity of Women's Voices. And we hope that that comes across when you look at the work, and it comes across when people talk about why they're here and feminism and the history and various things like that. But I just want to say I'm really happy to see so many people here to honor Ceres, because we deserve it. So thanks, and I turn it over to you, Jill, right?
Okay, thank you. So thanks for attending tonight to present and attend the panel of Vision, Voice, and Representation, a conversation with myself, Eleanor Heartney, and Isis Davis Marks. I'm going to go over the biographies first. Isis Davis Marks is a multidisciplinary artist, educator, and writer based in New York City. Her artwork has been exhibited nationally and internationally in venues including the Yale School of Art, the New York City Culture Club, and La Loma projects. Her visual work has also been featured in The Rumpus and The Nation. In her writing practice, Isis focuses on covering contemporary art, and most of her written work draws from philosophical and art historical texts to discuss issues including representation and contemporary visual culture. Her articles have been referenced in the New York Times and published in Smithsonian Magazine, Cultured Magazine, Phillips Auctions, Artsy, Frieze, and the art newspaper Hyperallergic, Communication Arts, King Kong Garçon, the Columbia Journal, and elsewhere. She's also a member of the Association Internationale de Critique d'Art. Eleanor Heartney is a New York-based art writer and cultural critic who has been writing about art since 1981. She's contributing editor to Art Press, editor-at-large for the Brooklyn Rail, former contributing editor to Art in America, and has written extensively on contemporary art issues for such other magazines as Art News, ArtNet, Art in Auction, The Washington Post, and the New York Times. Heartney was the 1992 recipient of the College Art Association's Frank Jewett Mather Award for Distinction in Art Criticism, and has also received grants from the New York Foundation for the Arts and the Asian Cultural Council. She's a co-author of After the Revolution, Women Who Transform Contemporary Art in 2007 with Prestel, which won the Susan Kopelman Award. She's also co-author with the same team of The Reckoning, Women Artists in the New Millennium, published in 2014 with Prestel, and the forthcoming Mothers of Invention, The Feminist Roots of Contemporary Art, being published through Lunt Humphreys. Heartney is past president of ICA USA, the American section of the International Art Critics Association, and in 2008 she was honored by the French government as the Chevalier dans l'Ordre des Arts et Lettres. And myself, Jill Connor, I'm an art writer, historian, and curator with a strong focus on contemporary and emerging art. I'm a contributor to After Image and Ceramics Art and Perception, and I've written for Art in America, ArtNet, Art Papers, Art US, Brooklyn Rail, Contemporary Magazine, Flash Art, Interview Magazine, Performance Art Journal, Riot Material Sculpture, White Hot, and White Wall. Okay, so to the questions, sorry. I just want to start off with my first encounter with feminism, and I think we're each going to share that. Mine occurred in the 1990s at the University of Washington in Seattle. I took a women's studies course, and then and then a women's health course, and then from that I learned about the third wave feminist movement that was ongoing at that time, and that's kind of where everything kind of started and kind of ended for me, because I know feminism has evolved since then. I'm just not sure of all the intricacies that have developed since then, so I wanted to turn it over to you, both of you, and see if you can add on to that.
Sure. I guess I can go first, or do you want to go first?
Well, maybe I'll go. I'm just thinking, we have representation of really sort of three different generations in a way here, and so I think that'll be interesting to talk about, kind of our different, entry points and kind of perceptions of the whole thing. So I came to New York in 1983. I had started writing before that, but I got here in 1983, so I think I'm same time as Ceres Gallery. And at that time, I had just started writing. I had come from Minnesota, and I was pretty new at the whole thing, but I knew I loved to write about art. And in 1983, the art world was still really it was quite male-oriented. In fact, it was a time when the East Village art scene, the neo-expressionism, all these things were like kind of burbling up. And it was also a time when the art market, which had been dormant for quite a while, suddenly just really took off. And one of the interesting things, of course, is the fact that during the 70s, which I missed here, and I'm sorry that I did, because I think that was, from everything that I know, was an incredibly fascinating time. That was a very good time for women artists. Partly because there wasn't much of a market, and so they were able to kind of explore all these things. There was a lot of experimental stuff going on. Then, the 80s, the art market explodes, and, all of a sudden it's like very male again. So that was kind of the world that I entered into, and things got a bit better in the 90s. For one thing, there was a kind of globalism, sort of ushered in this more multicultural kind of thing, and with that also sort of, I think, opening up doors, getting, going beyond some of the old definitions of what art was, certainly, kind of the end of Greenberg and formalism and all of that. But I would say that kind of my most significant, what was really kind of most significant to me in terms of feminism, or has been, is a kind of more recent thing, which is, Jill mentioned in my bio that I have this little writing collective. There are 4 of us, Nancy Princenthal, Sue Scott, and Helene Posner and myself. And so for the last 20 years, we've been writing books about women artists. And, we have the 3rd one is coming out actually in March. So this has been such I think for all 4 of us, has been such an important thing in our life. And, the subject, of course, has been feminism and women and artists, and each book has dealt with a different aspect. But it's also, I think, just in talking about collectives as a model of sort of collective action, it's been wonderful. And, each of us has pursued our individual careers as well, but we keep coming back to this collaborative process. And, especially during COVID, when the most recent book was gestating, oh my God, it was so great to be able to meet once a week on Zoom. It was sort of a lifesaver. So, for me, I would say, I've written a lot about feminism, different issues, but that collective experience of working, with this little group it's just been one of the most significant things for me in my life.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Thank you so much for that. And I think, thank you also, Jill, for asking the question. I think, it's really important to talk about what our individual associations with feminism are. I feel like I was raised a feminist. My mom used to read this bell hooks, children's book to me called Happy to Be Nappy. So I feel like that's kind of permanently ingrained in my brain. And I felt like my mom would always sort of talk about women's issues, particularly Black women's issues. She wouldn't let me have anything with a Disney princess kind of represented on it, because she thought that they were kind of reifying standards of white female beauty, and she didn't want me to kind of have that around me as a child. And she was always very kind of cognizant of that, very cognizant of the way I was presenting myself. And I think that, sort of growing up, in the early 2000s to the mid 2000s, I was born in 1997. So I kind of was born on the tail wave of the tail end of 3rd wave feminism. So I think I was kind of coming into it at a very interesting time. So it's always been a part of my life, and I think that it's been changing so much, especially with the rise of digital media. I think now, in the art world, those are discussions that are being had, but as we kind of challenge different constructs of gender, I think that those are sort of shifting in terms of the ways that we think about these things. I think that Legacy Russell is a curator who's doing a lot of interesting work around intersectional feminism, but also is challenging what does it even mean to be a woman, and a lot of different performance artists Juliana Huxtable are sort of thinking about these issues, but also a lot of textile artists at the moment are kind of challenging what that means. Ambrose is a textile artist who makes a lot of different multimedia work, who I think is making a lot of things that are kind of inspiring around this. Also, just a lot of discussions about like race like in kind of conversation with gender sort of being had too, and also class. I think that's really important, particularly in the art world, because there are a lot of barriers to entry if you don't sort of have the financial means to kind of enter it. So I think that for me, feminism is something that has always and probably always will play a role in the ways that I kind of view art.
Great. So since you've both been following like women's art at different points, what do you each think the progress that's been made so far in the field of women's art?
Well, I can
From
start
point
again
of
because
departure,
I
yeah.
go further back. Yeah.
Okay, right.
Well, one of the things, again, going back to this our little collective, writing group, one of the things we decided to do with the first book, we were working on the first book, I think we started in around 2004. And we decided, Sue Scott was very interested in including in the book some statistics. And we wanted to see kind of how, by certain metrics, how women were doing over time. So sort of starting in the 70s and moving up then to the 2000s. So we compiled these statistics and using metrics like important museum retrospectives, monographs, number of women in sort of certain major galleries, etc. And so we prepared these, and our expectation was that things, as we move towards the present, that things would be getting ever better, because it really did feel like, there was so much more interest in women artists, they were much more visible, et cetera, et cetera. What was surprising to us was that when we following these, decade by decade, in the 70s, of course, there was, especially in terms of the more commercial and visible art world, it was bad. And then it sort of got better, and it got better. In the 90s, it got better. And then it sort of flattened out. And in fact, this has been our experience, revisiting these statistics, is that it kind of flattened out at about, between, a quarter and a third, in all of these different metrics. And it just kind of stubbornly stayed there. So, it's interesting because the perception is that things are, and I think they are much better, but on the other hand, it's surprising how much not better they are. So, and actually, you're, as a young person, it'd be interesting to hear your perspective on all that.
Sure, and I think thank you for sharing yours as well, because I feel like it's really interesting to sort of hear about the trajectory over time, and I think one of the more interesting points you made in response to the previous question was about sort of how it ebbs and flows, things come in and out of fashion, and in the 80s it was one way, and then in the 90s it kind of went away, and then these conversations sort of have come back into the fore recently. I think especially with a lot of conversations about abortion rights sort of being rolled back, and I think also thinking about social media even is a really important, I think, axis for kind of evaluating these things, because now women are sort of, and non-binary people are kind of placing images of themselves online, and that's opening up a lot of conversations about well, what sort of standards do we sort of hold our selves to, and what do we consider beautiful versus not. So I do think that there has been some progress that has been made in a sense, because I think that, you do see a lot more women at galleries, and there are blue chip galleries, and there are sort of in museums and institutions, and I don't think a lot of people would sort of openly say that would not be allowed, but I think that now we have to deal with these sort of other questions about respectability, and also just sort of I think marketability is another interesting thing that I think we're probably going to touch on when we talk about artist collectives as well, but it seems like there's more of a focus on the individual, which to me is kind of placing tension with sort of previous feminist movements that we've sort of saw, because there was a lot of focus on the collective in the past.
Well, and in fact, to that point, I mean, going back to our statistics, I am skeptical of using the market as the, kind of end all and be all. I don't, that I think is a dangerous thing. On the other hand, it is very interesting that when you have these lists of the top best-selling artists, blah, 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 it's appalling how few women there are. So, they maybe, they're the second tier down, you get a lot more women. But even, and again, my colleague Sue Scott she's really been tracking this more. But, so artists like, Elizabeth Murray, and you think about their prices, relative to, I don't know, who would be, David Solly or something. And it's amazing, that, we are, here's someone, show with the modern retrospective, all this stuff. But the prices, don't reflect that. So, yeah, the whole market thing. I mean, as I say, I'm sort of leery about using that as a measure of success in the art world. And I think you're right. We should need to talk about kind of this other model, of collectivity. But it is amazing, that it's so persistent, this gap.
Yeah, I think it's persistent. I think, and it's complicated to talk about like the market as well, because I don't think it's the only metric, but I think it's a very telling one, and I think you're right about that, because you like look at the price of like Frida Kahlo versus like a Picasso, and like there's just such an enormous. I can't like say the exact numbers off the top of my head, but there's a very enormous gap, and I think that that's like a huge issue, and I think that I also do wonder what I think that it's good that now people more readily have access to this information with the internet, because you can sort of just like quickly Google these things and like find out what the statistics are, and it's something that's being talked about a lot, I think, in public circles, and I think the good thing is that like women are able to sort of like share their art more easily, and they don't have to go through the sort of like normal like gatekeeping ways of sort of galleries. They can kind of just like bring it directly to the consumer via like Instagram or like TikTok or like other like sort of venues. But I think on the other hand, it's like, there is still a value to like certain institutions like MoMA or like the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and like they do still have a certain form of like prestige, so it's kind of like a back and forth.
Yeah.
And it sounds like feminism itself has kind of moved beyond like like what I experienced as the relic of the 90s, which is the third wave feminism. Now it's something more different. It keeps moving forward, but it's also, I'm guessing, with the internet, it's utilizing technology, I guess, to become or to stay relevant and to keep embracing tangible issues. Do you think that there's any similar new ways that feminism has been utilizing to sort of stay in front of people's vision and attention along with art?
Well, I think this is a question for you.
I can try to answer it as best as I can. I know that like in the mid 2010s there was like a movement called the Art Ho Collective, and it was kind of just like a lot of women of color on the internet, and they were posting pictures of themselves like often against like photoshopped backgrounds, and they were sort of saying like, see, look at me, like I belong in front of this like Van Gogh, and like I'm on the internet and I'm making art and I'm like pretty loud about it. And there are a couple of other artists who have kind of risen to prominence recently, one of whom is Qualisha Wood, who makes these like sort of like beautiful tapestry woven pieces, and like one of them was recently acquired by the Met, and it's sort of like she takes like these pictures of herself and like kind of puts them against like grids and in front of like different like sort of like windows, and it sort of looks like she's on a screen. So I think that there are a lot of people who are engaging with digital media and who are like having these discussions about them, and I think that a lot of people are also kind of like sharing this art online and are working through these issues. I think other people who are kind of like working through these issues, I know I mentioned like Legacy Russell, but like Shawnee McElwain Holloway, like she does like a lot of like performance art around these issues, and like taking pictures of herself and like challenging the ways in which women are kind of seeing themselves. And like Amalia Ullman also had like a pretty prominent performance piece of art called Excellences and Imperfections, I think, and she was essentially like taking pictures of herself as she kind of like went through everyday life, but she also created like a fake online avatar for herself where she was like living this like very luxurious life, and then eventually revealed that it was like not entirely real. But I think something that a lot of artists are still contending with is like, how do we challenge these things as opposed to like, how do we play into them, right? Because I do still think that there's a politics of like desirability around these issues, and like we do sort of know for a fact that like Facebook and like Snapchat and Instagram and TikTok, they do push certain faces forward with certain features. And I think featureism is like a prominent thing that sort of happens on these like social media sites. So like, how do we sort of contend with these things? I think that that's why, like, to me, the art whole movement was like very important, because it was like a lot of like Black women with like fuller bodies and fuller figures sort of talking about art and how those things were like important to them. But I think that as time has sort of moved on, it's become a little bit more commodified, and we're sort of seeing like a more like slender, like lighter skinned like body that's sort of being like privileged. So I think that, again, as you had sort of mentioned before, like these things kind of like go in and out of fashion.
Well, and there's, I mean, you know, from my old fogey position here, you know, I think it's on the one hand, you know, the internet has opened up possibilities. You're right, and allowed, you know, people to, you know, you can jump over a lot of the gatekeepers, you know, and you know, you go directly. But on the other hand, there's also a kind of, I guess, a lack of discrimination. And you know, Ben Davis did a really fun article, I don't know, a couple of months ago, and it was about, this is the most, I guess, the most famous on social media artist that you've never heard of, and it's some guy that, of course, none of us have ever heard of, but you know, has, you know, sort of huge following, and you know, it's very, you know, kind of commercial looking stuff, but you know, so the internet, I mean, it's you know, it's a kind of double-edged sword in a way, you know, you know, because you're right, it maximizes certain kinds of appeal, and then other things then, you know, become sort of invisible. And yeah, so you know, it makes me nervous, I guess I would say.
And I just wanted to ask you if you could talk more about intersectional feminism, because that's one thing that I kind of never came across my attention, like my view, while I feel like I sort of left off in the 90s. I don't know.
Yeah. No, thank you for that question. I think it's a good one. But this scholar named Kimberly Crenshaw like kind of coined the term, I believe it was in the 1990s, about like intersectional feminism, and it kind of was expressing the need to not look at feminism as just something that's fundamentally about like women's issues, but like where do we sort of how do we kind of look at how race and class and other factors play into, you know, how we sort of like see ourselves. Like I don't even want to use the term woman, because then like there's also like a lot of questions that we need to be thinking about in terms of like gender queerness and like trans identity, which I don't fully feel comfortable talking about because like I am cis, but I do think that, you know, when we're talking about the like issues of feminism, like those need to be placed into like other conversations. Like Judith Butler also kind of talks about this a lot, like when she mentions that like gender is a performance, and it's like something that is kind of like learned to an extent, and it's not necessarily something that you're like born with necessarily. And a lot of other queer theorists have kind of like pushed the envelope as to like what does it mean to be like a woman. More recently, Andrea Long Chu has done a lot of writing about this. Like she recently came out with this book called Females, where she's talking about like notions of gender and like how, and she makes this claim that like everyone is a female, and like goes into this like sort of very long-winded analysis of like Valerie Solanas and like a lot of different other people. But yeah, I think that we're kind of at this inflection point now about gender, and like a lot of people are kind of finding new ways to discuss it. And I mentioned intersectionality because I think that it's one thing to sort of like talk about like what does it mean to be like a woman like in a blanket, but I think that because there are so many different types of women, and like there are so many people who don't even necessarily like identify as like a woman but also don't identify as a man, like there's a lot of different angles that we can kind of evaluate feminism by.
And I just again, from my old fogey point of view, you know, one of the issues that my little group, you know, sort of has wrestled with is sort of the question of what does feminism mean in a time of intersectionality and, you know, gender fluidity and all of this, because, you know, traditionally feminism, you know, it was really very much about kind of women women's experience and women's, kind of place in the world and putting, gaining, gaining access, gaining power, etc. But if everything becomes very fluid, where does that leave feminism? It's a question we wrestled with in terms of the books, because does it make sense to keep writing books about, that are focused just on women artists, if this is the other thing that's happening? And also, are you losing something, if you make things too fluid? One of the things that we did do with the most recent book, for the first time, the most recent book is called Mothers of Invention, The Feminist Roots of Contemporary Art. And we went back to the 70s, looked at 4 themes. Each of us picked a theme that was dear to our heart, and sort of tracing it forward and seeing how these ideas that started with sort of women pioneers in the 70s and have kind of blossomed out. But one of the things that we decided to do was we included some men, because it didn't really make sense for us anymore, not so much in the founding, the founding women, the founding pioneers, but that, to be a feminist isn't, it's not necessarily, it's just not about gender, but it is about a certain kind of sense of certain ideas, a certain genealogy, a certain lineage. So it seemed to make sense to include some men in this book. But it's a, it's a thing, it's a question that we've wrestled with, and, in terms of also, spaces like this, what is the place of a all-women's gallery, how do you deal with that? I think these are complex issues now.
And it sounds like there's going to always be room for, I don't want to call it improvement, but just expansion, I guess, is what I can think of. But we also talked about art collectives and the effectiveness that has for women artists. Did you sort of elaborate further on that, either one of you?
Well, I guess I can start, and then, again, it's great to have somebody with this, other young perspective here.
It's great to hear yours too.
Well, but again, it's sort of, if you're thinking about feminism, and this is one of the things, again, we talk about in this current book, if you're thinking about feminism, not so much as a, breaking through the glass ceiling kind of thing, but you're thinking about it, in terms of a kind of larger, connective philosophy. One of the things that we, again, came to, and especially in the chapter that I wrote, which is on ecofeminism, is that it's about a kind of interconnectivity, relational kind of being, that it's about, kind of getting rid of some of those, certainly those hierarchies, and, and also kind of coming up with sort of collective goals that, how do we, what a feminist world, I just recently did an article actually on, the revival or the return of the goddess idea in art. And, the goddess idea, got denigrated a lot, particularly in the 90s, I think, when you came up. Yeah. It was essentialist, all of this stuff. But really, in doing research and going back and looking at sort of the original concept, it was much more about, it wasn't about just supplanting, the male god with the female god, but it was about a different sort of vision of what spirituality and society could mean. So I think that, the sort of collective notion, it's something that was true, particularly in the 70s, a lot of women kind of experimenting with that and, coming together, finding a, sisterhood and all of this. And then, and again, as we're saying, it sort of ebbs and flows. It felt like certainly in the 80s when I came in, that was not so much a thing, and even in the 90s, but perhaps coming back more so now, and I guess you would have more to say about that.
I'll try, but I think yes, like now, but I was also thinking a lot about like Linda Good Bryan and like Just Above Midtown. Like I saw that show before it closed at MoMA, and like I kind of like that model of like collectivity, and like because it was like, yes, there were like a lot of women who showed there, like Elizabeth Catlett, but like there were also like men and like David Hammond and the Body Prints, and like she was like really trying to create a space for people, and they had like a whole little preschool program for like children, and like I really liked that idea because thinking about feminism as like a form of like collectivity, I think that, you know, that should also mean like providing resources for one another and having people kind of collaborate. And I think that now like you're kind of beginning to also see like online communities of people who are kind of like engaging with these ideas. So it's kind of been, I think, inspiring to me just seeing sort of people kind of collect online, like forming different publications, you know, like even publications like Bomb, where you have like, you know, artists interviewing other artists, and I think coming together and doing different things. There also used to be another collective called Bufu, which means like by us, for us, and they would like host different events in different parts of Brooklyn. To kind of bring like young creatives of color together. Like I think it was mostly founded like by Black and Asian creators. So you see different things kind of existing in different places, but I think unfortunately like over the past like 5 years or so, like a lot of collectives they haven't really felt as strong, as robust. So I think that as we kind of come out of the pandemic and as we sort of see more people kind of gathering into physical spaces again, like it will be good to see like people kind of coming together in person.
Yeah, I think the pandemic was so isolating. I think, and it did a lot of things. You know, were put on hold. A lot of things retrenched. So I think it's important to be in a physical place. You know, this is actually one of the first. You know, I do a lot of lectures and stuff. It's usually on Zoom. You know, I mean, it's really nice to be in a place with people.
Yeah.
So I was wondering also with women's art collectives in New York and beyond, would it be interesting or good for their long-term sustainability if they also thought about collaborating amongst each other? Like, is it still a political issue, or is there now something like is there a better dynamic in place where collectivity can actually occur to sort of sustain this idea rather than, because it sounds like the idea of the art market, the goal there is sort of an illusion itself. So rather than moving toward that, what about moving towards more interactive collectivity or events like that? I don't know.
Yeah, well, I mean, I sometimes I feel like we've got, we talk about the art world, but it's really a lot of parallel art worlds, And yeah, it's true that the kind of more market-oriented art world is very individualistic and competitive, and is not about this sort of collectivity. And then you have, often kind of institutions are more receptive to that kind of collective thing. I mean, I was just at the Rikrit Tiravanija show, which is, at PS1 right now, and that's his whole thing. I think the show is called A Lot of People. That's his material. It's a lot of people. But yeah, so I think that these are kind of different ways of I guess existing in the world and in the art world. But I think that it is indeed. I think as the worlds, also the art worlds become much more global. It's not just the internet, but just it has just opened up so much that to have more kind of cross fertilization, I think is a very good thing, and I think it is happening.
Right.
I mean, what's your perspective on that?
I think you're right. I think it's happening. I think it is something that has definitely been true for me, like to connect with people, especially who aren't kind of based here. Like a lot of, I know a lot of artists from the South have especially like expressed this to me, like, with a lot of shows sort of taking place in New York, it's often it was harder for them, I think, to get visibility, but now with the internet and with, Instagram in particular, there's a lot more opportunity for people who might not necessarily have been looked at by like New York galleries to sort of get seen. It also kind of like changes the ways that you're able to have like a studio practice, I think, like when you have like the internet, like you don't necessarily have to invite so many people into your physical space in order for those things to get seen. So I think that kind of also like breaks down certain barriers. Like I'm also thinking about like certain class issues because MFA programs are so expensive. Like if people can get visibility, or if people can get like a certain sort of notoriety without going through some of these like hoops that they've had to go through in the past, I think that that's kind of exciting, especially like when you think about like these issues of like intersectionality, right? Like some certain things can be like real barriers to people.
Well, thanks for coming tonight to the panel. We were overjoyed to present.
Thank you.